especially for my friend Chris. Not that kind of Christian here, reading from J.M. Barries. Peter Pan and Wendy. I said for all of you lost boys out there, I'll read chapter 2 from this wonderful book that was given to my wife Sharon when she was very, very young. So you can see this is how Mr. Darling disliked Nana. Wonderful illustrations there, which I assume is one of the children, and Nana the nanny dog, I guess. We rejoin the story just after Mrs. Darling has watched Peter Pan burst in through a window when she was just in the middle of having a doze. Chapter 2. How Mr. Darling disliked Nana. Mrs. Darling cried out in surprise, and that moment the door opened and Nana came in. When she saw the boy, she growled and sprang at him. She did not catch him, for he leaped through the window before she could shut it. But she caught his shadow and brought it in her mouth to Mrs. Darling. It was quite a common sort of shadow. It might have belonged to any boy. Mrs. Darling rolled it up carefully and put it away in a drawer. She was more puzzled than ever, but she knew if she told Mr. Darling what she'd seen, he'd say it all came out of having a dog for a nurse, and really Nana had done her best. Nothing more happened until about a week later. It was Friday evening. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were dressing up to go to a party, and Nana was busy with the children, getting them to bed. She began as usual with Michael. She'd put on a bath water for him, taken the towel in her mouth, and she set Michael on her back to carry him, but Michael was cross because he couldn't stay up any longer. He shouted and kicked and said he wasn't going to bed. I won't, he cried. And I don't love you any more, Nana. Mrs. Darling looked so pretty that Michael became good at once. She was all in white, with a necklace that Mr. Darling had given her, and a bracelet that Wendy had lent her. Wendy, though it was lovely to have a bracelet good enough to lend to a pretty lady. Mrs. Darling was like a smile and a kiss and a flower, all made into one. Wendy and John began playing at being father and mother. They had a make-believe baby born, and were ever so pleased. Michael couldn't play because he was in the bath. It was terribly lonely being soaped and sponged, and you can't think how particular Nana was with this wash, which, when all the others were so jolly, Michael jumped out of the water, and before he was half dry, cuddling up to Mrs. Darling. Some mothers would have minded hugging a wet child, but Mrs. Darling was very sweet. At this moment, the door banged open and slammed shut. Not by itself, of course, but because Mr. Darling rushed in, raving, ramping, roaring with rage. Mr. Darling was a kind man, but he had got what they call a short temper. That is, his temper was very good for a short while, and then for a short while longer, and then very bad for a short while, and so on, and turn about. It was often rather awkward because he changed so suddenly. This time he had no temper. This time bad temper had come on in a minute. Mr. Darling had been trying to tie his party tie, and it wouldn't let him fix it. Ties are often like that, especially if they know you're in a hurry. "What is the matter, father dear?" said Mrs. Darling. "Matter?" he yelled. Mr. Darling, his eyes nearly started out of his head. "Why, this tie round. Why, this tie will tie around the bedpost, all right, but it won't go round my neck. And I've done it 20 times over, and it simply refuses to be tied." "Dear, dear," said Mrs. Darling. The children all tried to put on expressions of showing how sorry they were, but Mr. Darling took no notice. He worked himself up into an even worse rage, and went on to say that they would all have starved by now, because, he bellowed, he wouldn't be able to go to the party unless his tie was tied properly around his neck. And if he didn't go to the party, he should never go to the office again, and then they should never earn any more money again, and he and Mrs. Darling and the children would become poor, homeless, beggars, all on account of the tie. "Let me try, dear," said Mrs. Darling in a voice like a cooing dove, and she fastened his tie for him, quite calmly and easily. The next moment, Mr. Darling, in wonderful good humour, was prancing about the room with Michael on his back. His short temper was over until next time. Everybody was dancing and jumping and squeaking with delight, when Nana, who generally joined in romps, hurried in, and she knocked up against Mr. Darling by accident as he whirled to and fro, and a lot of her long hairs came off upon his new trousers. This annoyed him dreadfully, and although Mrs. Darling had brushed him clean, he began to talk again about how stupid it was having a dog for a nurse. Mrs. Darling felt sad that he did not get on with Nana, so she told him about the strange boy who'd came in and gone out of the window, and how Nana had tried to seize the boy, but only got hold of his shadow. "Pooh, nonsense," said Mr. Darling. But when he was shown the shadow, he left off saying nonsense. It was not a very odd shadow, but of course, being left wrapped up in a drawer, it made it quite queerer. While Mr. Darling was looking at it, Nana returned to give Michael his cough medicine, carrying the bottle and the spoon in her mouth. Michael said nearly at once he wouldn't take it. On the same night, Nana waited patiently. "Come, be a man, Michael," said his father. "Won't," replied Michael, as his pet word. "I will fetch you a chocolate to take it up to have after it," said Mrs. Darling, and left the room. "You shouldn't pamper him," cried Mr. Darling, and he went on. "Michael, when I was a little boy, I took medicines without a thought this farce. I said, 'Thank you, dear father and mother, for giving me the stuff to make me well, and the medicine you shall take I should take was much nastier than yours. I would take it now, just show you the bottle, and that will be the lot of it.'" And we will pause there at page 19. That's it for tonight. More for all you lost boys and girls another time.